Welcome, everybody. Welcome to spring 2021. I gotta say, it's a heck of a lot better than spring 2020 was. That was kind of a bummer. For folks that live in the city, they've been poking their heads out of their apartments and starting to get back into the real world. But truth be told, it is different than it was a year ago. I host a podcast called Building Places. That's another show. And last year, about this time, we asked this question: do cities need urban warehouses? And I talked to Leslie Lanne, and her answer was yes. Yes, they do need them. Leslie works with industrial property owners in and around New York, all over the Northeast. And we've got Leslie back today because we know we need them. Now, the next question is how? How do we get them? How do we build these last mile facilities in places like New York City? This is Where We Buy. It's the show where we talk with retail experts and we visit the places where we buy. My name is James Cook. I research retail and real estate for JLL. This episode we're recording live on YouTube in front of a virtual global internet studio audience. So you guys watching live, if you have questions or comments as we go, feel free to type them into the chat and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. And now let's welcome Leslie Lanne. Welcome, Leslie. How are you doing today?
Hey, James. How are you?
I am awesome. For those who don't know Leslie, she specializes in institutional landlord and tenant rep in the Northeast region. So, Leslie, where are you joining us from today? Are you in New York?
I am not. I'm actually sitting very close to the beach in New Jersey and getting super excited that it's almost summer and we can actually go enjoy it.
Yeah, I did a little bit of a getaway vacation myself last week, and it was weird to pack up luggage. Well, it was so weird for about 10 minutes, and then it was totally awesome and normal again. So I love a good vacation.
Well, come to the beach. We're ready for you.
Oh, yeah. I love the Jersey Shore. That's great. All right. So let's get into it. And folks, remember, as we're talking, if we say something that sparks a question or comment in your head, just throw it into the chat box and we'll get to it. So let's talk about sort of historically. Let's say I live in the city. I don't, but let's say I do. I order something. Where historically has that stuff been coming from that was delivered to cities?
So traditionally, it's probably come from New Jersey, especially if you needed it in a couple days. If you didn't need it in a couple days, it could have come from anywhere in the United States. But all that's changed now that we kind of want our stuff when we want it and we want it now.
So it came from Jersey, but that's not close enough. I mean, Jersey's right there. Why isn't that close enough?
Oh, James, if you have ever tried to commute in this area, that you would know the answer. But really, it has to do with congestion and speed, and the consistency of the goods to the consumer. And so, with this many people and this many pinch points, I mean, people forget that most of the New York MSA is on an island, whether it's Manhattan or whether it's Queens or Brooklyn or even Long Island. And so we have all these different pinch points as like bridges and tunnels, and there's lots of places for the goods to get stuck, and it's just hard to do it in a super fast manner.
And just because of the explosion of online shopping, there's, I'm sure, an expectation that things get there immediately, right? Or in an hour or 2 hours?
Absolutely. I think we'd already seen it pre-COVID, where people just expected their goods to come a lot quicker to them, especially in the city where you may have to time if you need to be home or if you need to receive it in the office. You need a pretty specific window in which you can be there for your stuff to get there, and that kind of goes back to that consistency piece that you have to basically guarantee what your consumer is expecting, and so we've really struggled with that as the pandemic hit because everything was just accelerated. The need for these sorts of fast delivery times and the amount of goods that we're getting kind of pushed through the system, we just didn't have the capacity for it. I think not only here but many times across the U.S. in certain kind of asset sectors, whether it be cold storage or cooler or consumer goods, we didn't have enough.
So it sounds like we've got the demand for these last mile facilities in places like Manhattan and in the other boroughs. What does that what do they look like? I mean, they can't look like a suburban, million square feet industrial facility. How do you make it work?
Yeah, no, they definitely don't. I mean, the problem is that have these super, densely populated urban areas, and so we lack land. We lack land for everything. So it's not like we can just take, about 50 acres and drop a building onto it. So we've had to look at things in more of a vertical manner. And we're fortunate. When we talked last year, we were starting construction on some of these cool projects. Dare I say, we're talking about second gen type of assets now because we've already seen this first cycle of new generation either under construction or about to deliver, and we've gone up. And we've gone up in a way that's much more similar to Asia and parts over in Europe because they have some of these same challenges. So we use those a little bit as a blueprint and then put a little bit of a New York spin on it. And we're coming out of the ground right now, and some of these places should be opening at the end of the year.
Wow, wow. So that's pretty fast. I mean, when we talked a year ago, there was some stuff that was planned, some stuff that was under construction at that point, right?
You know what, James? Put up 640 real quick. This
Okay,
is a
hold on.
great. This is sometimes the visual helps. I know it helps me.
All right.
Um, 640 Columbia is a great example. This is a building that's in Red Hook. It's under construction right now. It's 3 levels with a whole bunch of interstitial parking. You can actually see Manhattan and skyline in the distance. But this is a great example of what a lot of these buildings look like, and that are real now, and have been very successful. You can see the backside of it. And this not only services Manhattan, because I think we all think about Manhattan all the time as kind of the epicenter, and it absolutely is in many ways. But these facilities will definitely service the boroughs that they're located in. Think of it as like your friendly neighborhood distribution center.
So it sounds like this concept started in places like Asia before it came to the U.S. But you mentioned there's a New York spin. What do you have to do differently to make something like this work in New York?
So it really has to do with the size of our vehicles. Is in this first gen and how we were designing those buildings. We have larger vehicles that bring the stuff, the inbound goods to the facilities, and then we're also seeing a pretty awesome trend of having a lot of the delivery vehicles that come into the neighborhoods be electric. And so we're designing those a little bit differently now, making sure that they have enough power, making sure they have the conduit that's readily available to the occupiers in there so that they can plug and go. Now, kind of on that next second generation, we're addressing different modes of transportation. So on foot, those push bikes, if you've been in New York City, anytime in really a lot of the major cities, it looks like almost like an ice cream cart that someone's pushing down the street. People are exploring a lot of different ways to get the goods, and of course, bicycles, of course. But we're trying to figure out how we have these new facilities that have all these sorts of different transportation nodes that are part of them now, which is pretty cool.
I feel like New York's always been big on delivery. I mean, we've talked about this before, where it's one of the few places where you can order a sandwich in the middle of the night and get somebody to bring it over to you with a bicycle. I mean, is bicycle delivery one of the kinds of things where, I mean, how do you set up for something like that? Is there certain pickup areas for these couriers?
I think it will be. I think it will be in places where you have, you know, if it's even possible, kind of super or uber core density, and you have a facility located in it, and someone is coming either on foot or on bicycle. And I assume we're going to see, the scooter type modes. We're going through a new phase of that in New York City right now, and some of these electric type vehicles that had some stumbling blocks when they first came to our cities, coming back into the market now. So I think that will be a lot more prevalent kind of within those neighborhoods where they're doing a high volume back and forth, right to the doorsteps themselves or to the doormen.
How big is this project that we looked at? And you said this is in Red Hook.
Yes.
How big is this?
So all in, and we count square footage not just inside the box, because while that's super important, the outside of the box is just as important. It's about 400,000 square feet. So that includes a lot of the parking areas, and they're not, we say parking, but it's really fleet storage and staging. We have to figure out a way for the vehicles that are coming in there or the people on foot to come in and get the goods and then exit. So that's just as important, if not the most important thing in the design of a lot of these buildings.
Interesting. So one of the other things too I want to ask you about is as shopping has shifted online, especially in the past year, we saw this huge jump. When you buy things like clothing online, you don't get to try them on advance, so you're more likely to return them, which means returns are going up. So there's what we call the reverse logistics stream coming back at you of returns. How do you deal with that? Do you send that stuff? I mean, where does that go?
So that's a question that many people are trying to answer right now, and it's just part of this major shift in industrial logistics. A lot of it still is exiting the urban core and going to facilities that are outside of this area. We do envision, though, as people begin to expand their operations in the city, that they will have different sorts of sorting and different components within these facilities, and then that will be part of it. But right now, they have to go out to the suburbs.
Gotcha. To specific, I imagine specific facilities that are just set up to receive them. Yeah.
Many of them do. Some people do, multiple lanes within their own distribution facilities, but there are some that are solely dedicated just to returns.
Interesting. So I imagine you see all kinds of occupiers out there. It's not just pure play e-commerce, right? It's traditional retailers too. Can you talk a little bit more about the kinds of folks that are looking at these facilities?
Sure. It's really everyone. When we start talking about e-commerce, e-commerce is a pretty broad word for what all the retailers are doing and what 3PLs are doing. And so we see most of the brands coming through either as their own setup, but traditionally they're coming through some sort of third-party logistic provider who maybe is servicing a whole bunch of folks through one facility as in the last mile. That right now is more typical today, especially with speed to market and getting these facilities set up is the name of the game. And so if someone had an in-place asset and an in-place business model, it was really easy to pick up the phone or send an email to them and get your product to them to get it to the consumers for the last mile. But we can't forget in the urban core that when we talk about e-com, food and beverage is also one of our other huge drivers. And that's food and beverage direct to consumer, which I think we saw a huge shift in over the last 14, 15 months, but also the B2B. Because it's the same sort of challenges that many of the businesses have is getting their orders when they're supposed to be there on time. So that if there's a 1 and 2 position, those are probably 1 and 2.
Interesting. I hadn't even thought about B2B food. Well, we're talking about these, ghost kitchens delivering, virtual, whatever restaurants delivering food. It sounds like your coworkers there as well.
Sorry, that's Bear.
No, this is live TV. What? It's Bear?
What's his name?
Okay. Hey, Bear. No, this is why I love doing this stuff is because, it's real life. So we talked a lot about ghost kitchens delivering food to consumers, but I hadn't even thought about what would this be like, delivering produce to restaurants, that type of thing?
Correct. What about your wine? What about, your beer and your liquor. I mean, all of that has to get someplace. The linens that are at your favorite restaurants or at the hotels that are beginning to open up. There is a whole B2B service industry that we desperately need places for, and so that's part of this um, urban distribution model that has kind of always been there, but now it's even exacerbated because of e-commerce and the need for additional space.
So New York is just starting to open up. People are starting to get back to restaurants, more clothing, in-person clothing shopping, that type of thing. All of the non-essential retail they've kind of been skipping for a while. How is that going to affect the calculus around last mile? Is that going to shift things? Is it going to increase demand or just shift it to new places? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so I don't think that we're going backwards, I think is my short answer. I know that I will welcome the chance to spend a little bit more time in the stores. From a supply chain standpoint, we do have a supply issue in a lot of our goods right now, as we're still facing a myriad of challenges from COVID and kind of from sourcing all the way through to the last mile. But I don't think that, for a lot of people that maybe never use e-com as much, I don't think that their reliance on it is going to backpedal. So for me, and this is not just in the urban areas, but throughout the entire United States, we need a ton more new development. And that might be easier to solve other places. But in the urban core, it's very difficult to solve this because of the competitive land situation. So just for example, we have utilized about 100 acres with inside the urban core in New York City for redevelopment in the last 3.5 to 4 years. So that's 100 acres that has to be that's now turning into industrial distribution space, and we're still below a 3% occupancy rate. So and that's with the lockdowns. So we have real concerns about the ability to get the goods to the consumers in normalized times, and God forbid, if we have another situation where we all are spending a little bit more time locked in our houses.
So the rents to, justify the construction of these are going to be a lot higher. Does the price of that get passed on to the price of the goods that are being sold? Does it get incorporated into like separate delivery fees? Do you have a sense of
So
how
I
that
think that
works?
you have to look at it that they're unlocking a marketplace. So to the extent that you're not able to provide this service that candidly most of the country has, you're losing. When I think about, you go and you click on something, you see you can't get it, you close the window and you move on. So to the extent that you don't want to unlock the largest population in the United States with the most buying power, that's completely crazy to me. So it's not even necessarily a pass on, but you're unlocking the ability to do business with more people. To that extent, there is a transportation component to it, that is a cost savings because we're located a little bit closer to the consumers themselves, and so that helps offset what some may say is increased cost of real estate, but that's just the difference of being closer to your people.
Gotcha. I think when I think about the U.S., I think about kind of a large country with a lot of space. Are there other cities that are dense enough in the U.S. to justify these kind of projects?
There definitely is. I think that when we start looking at some of the same drivers, the congestion, the pinch points, I think we definitely have to put San Francisco in that bucket. Los Angeles, Chicago. I think that Washington D.C. is right for this. If anyone's ever sat on the belt, they'll understand. And especially with this second location of Amazon's headquarters being there, I think that's a place you're going to see quite a bit of it here coming very shortly.
Gotcha. So let's kind of think about that a little bit more. What have you learned by working on these projects in New York? What's some advice you might give as you or other people start working on them in other cities, like say San Francisco?
So I think that the first thing is, and especially in this generation, is to focus on the fleet. I think that by not accommodating fleet, whether it be for the staging or for the storage, would be a problem. I think that is something that's super, super important right now.
Okay. So when you say that, it's like leave enough space to where you can park trucks and vans and stuff like that. That's what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. You need to have space for the movement of the goods coming in and out of the facility itself, as well as potentially if your fleet is not moving. So where does your fleet go at night if it's not running 24/7?
Gotcha. And not a, again, in the suburbs, not a huge question, but in in a dense city, suddenly that parking becomes that big deal. Okay, so let's see. What else do I want to ask you? Well, okay, so it sounds like this is being driven by retailers who want to access markets like New York. Does, from the investment perspective, because you work with institutional investors, do they see the value in these kinds of projects yet? Do they understand them?
Absolutely. I think that 3 or 4 years ago, people were really scratching their heads and trying to figure out, probably most importantly, what these projects would look like on the exit, and how they would work, and would this model be adapted by the occupier community? And now we have, the ability to look back and know that the answer is yes, they will be. And so, all of the major players on the development front are absolutely clamoring to get into these areas, and also the equity, which is an important component of it, and the debt, to make these projects happen. So, any kind of typical name that we see in the suburban market, we see those same players in the urban core.
Gotcha. So they get it. They want to be a part of it, and there's a real future. Well, let's see. I was going back and I listened to this episode of Building Places that we recorded just about a year ago, just to see what I thought, if things had changed. And one of the things I made a note of is you'd predicted that we'd have 4 to 5 multi-story facilities in New York and other dense cities. How far along in that prediction are we?
I'm counting. So right now we have 5, excuse me, that are under construction in New York, and I think still have line of sight to another 4. And depending on how many buildings they put up, that number may change. But at this point, we're still nervous about that, because we just think that we need more. I think that what's going to be super cool to have to look at is going to be the ones that happen outside of New York. Everyone kind of says, well, New York's its own animal, and that's absolutely true. But when you start seeing these sort of urban infill distribution centers that already exist, maybe they're not multi-story, maybe they're single story, maybe they're just a fleet that's sitting there waiting to go pick up boxes from another truck. They already exist, and so there's going to be each city is going to have their own spin on it, and that's I think what's going to be super cool to see. We're working on several across the country right now, with our urban logistics group that I can't wait to talk about at some point.
Yeah, that's exciting. So more to come in the future. As I think about sort of like trends that I think are really going to affect this, one of the things I think about is autonomous vehicles and drone delivery. Is it a time where people, as we build these, are thinking about that? I don't even know what that looks like. There's a heliport on the roof or something, or maybe there's,
so
I don't know. Do we think about that yet?
I'd rather see in places where it's hard for me to predict the future, and I think drones are very difficult in an urban environment. So I like to focus on kind of what I can see, and what I can see here, is the waterways. So I think that probably in the future we'll be doing more deliveries via the waterways, and being able to really unlock that access, because it is a benefit of being close to the rivers and the harbors.
So tell me a little bit more about that, because I'm picturing in my mind the island of Manhattan, for example. You've got water on either side. So are you saying that we're going to start, I order, I don't know, a TV, and it gets dropped into a boat and comes up the side of the island, or what are you thinking about?
I think it's more that a lot of these distribution centers are located near public transportation. We have New York waterways, And so, to the extent, if you ride the subway in New York City, you see couriers all the time that have goods with them, and that are moving about the city. I think that, something that I envision something like that, where we'll be accessing the waterways in that manner, because and you can skip a lot of the surface streets, especially if you are going into the island of Manhattan, or maybe you're going from South Brooklyn into North Brooklyn.
Interesting. So anything else, like what's your sense of, it sounds like we've got multiple projects going right now under construction. Is there a sense that we're running out of redevelopment sites, and that's kind of it and it's going to taper off, or is there kind of building momentum for this?
So we definitely have the momentum. I think what we're trying to do now is figure out how to utilize smaller footprints within the city, and that's a huge challenge, because the larger footprints allow us to go vertical with fleet, meaning that we can take fleet up ramps, or we can take them up like a helix ramp. But when we start talking about 1 to 2 acres, it gets a little bit more difficult, and so we have to continue to explore the possibility of using more vertical transportation, which is a super fancy way of saying high-speed freight elevators. But that's something that isn't necessarily a new thing. And the one thing that we need to ensure with all these facilities is speed and efficiency within there. So, that might be okay for a single tenant that is, doing a lot of automation and MHE in their facilities. But what happens if we have smaller footprints and smaller users, and they're all starting to share or maybe not share these sort of freight elevators, and how do you manage that? And so I really feel like we're evolving to that kind of 2.0 model, and we are going to see some smaller facilities come out. But that to me is really the next frontier, because at some point we will run out of these large sites. And also, I do think there's going to be a need from users with smaller footprints that maybe don't want to use a 3PL, and maybe they're not 1 million square feet. And so I think that's really what excites me the most about this next wave, is figuring out what those look like.
So these, and forgive me for my ignorance, but so these elevators can you drive vehicles on them, or is it just for moving goods up and down?
So ideally, we start with the basic of putting a forklift in there with pallets. That's kind of what your stuff comes on, those big wooden, they look like big wooden, I call them crates, but like single grates. Yeah. And so that's where you start with. And maybe at some point we'll be using them, to put larger vehicles in them. And that's not a new thing. If you live in the cities, you probably have seen your car go into an elevator and go up. But we would need that for different size vehicles. And what about the inbound traffic? Is that coming in a 53-foot tractor trailer? Is it coming in through a box truck? Where do those go? So that's kind of the part that's super fun right now, is figuring out how to make that work. And to get the feedback from the occupiers and the retailers to see if that does work for them.
And Leslie, what about, I know that in most cities there's, the warehouse district, which is like these old school warehouses that many of them have been converted into like loft apartments or, whatever creative redevelopments. Are any of those old school warehouses usable, or is it just, they don't have the clearance or whatever?
So they are being used. There's definitely some old manufacturing facilities. I mean, that's really what they were originally built for, that are still in use. They have freight elevators. They typically have lower clear height. They're columns, we call them mushroom columns, because at the bottom and the top they kind of go out like a mushroom. And some people can use those. We have found that most of the modern users of today, that logistically, when they start looking at the flow of their facility and their inbound and outbound movement of goods, that's a pretty big challenge. I will say it's been a great solution for a lot of the emerging companies in the city, and those that are doing, high touch or manufacturing or something, in that lane. So I think it's a great feeder for a lot of folks, especially as we're seeing, whether it's micro fulfillment or ghost kitchen or all these new words that are being thrown around. I think it's a great spot for them. It is harder for the larger users.
Gotcha. So it's tough to get that kind of scale. Well, interesting. Let's close it out. We're already almost out of time here. let me ask you a big picture question. I know you don't want to get too futuristic or anything, but just for a minute, let's say, I don't know, 10 years in the future. Do you expect we're going to be to the point where there's a whole bunch of these facilities now operating in multiple cities in the U.S.? What do you think that looks like?
I do, and I think anywhere there's a lot of people, you're going to see a lot of these facilities. So we're talking about kind of the leader of people in New York City, but I think that anywhere that you have clusters of people together, you're going to start seeing facilities that are designed to get you your goods pretty quick. Depending on what they look like, it may be smaller. It may be something that's in back of your I don't want to call them malls, your outdoor lifestyle centers where you go to get the goods or more of an experience, at the front of the store, and then it gets delivered to you in the afternoon. I think that's something that's probably going to be a lot more viable. But the industrial sector is not slowing down, and we've changed how we buy.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason my dog was barking is because there was a delivery man here.
You can't avoid it. You can't
avoid it.
I can't tell you how many Zoom conference calls and different sessions I've been on, and there's a delivery person out there, that they need you to sign sometimes. Yeah, it's a whole new world. I have one more question I'll ask you. So you've been all through COVID. We've been building these, you've been under construction with these projects. What's that been like? How have you been able to physically do your job on site? Has it really been affected by the pandemic?
So the one thing that's been awesome, and we've done a lot of education, and that's been from the beginning of this process, even pre-COVID. And we're fortunate because we've got a great team here that really built out our proprietary Blackbird system. It's a mouthful. That has allowed us to really, whether it's talking with the institutional owner and investor side of life, or whether it's the occupier side, really walk them through this new world, and explain to them how it works and where these locations are, and a whole bunch of other things that we go over with them. It's allowed us to do it virtually, which is pretty awesome. We are in the city a couple days a week, on site. People talk about going back to the office. We don't do office. We do industrial. So we've been on site. We've been on site through most of this process, and we've been fortunate enough that a lot of these projects have gone full speed ahead, and have had great construction teams as part of them, and great sponsors and great developers that are making it happen, which is pretty cool.
I love it. Well, that is awesome, Leslie, and we're just about out of time. So we're going to have you back again. Let's do it in another year and see where we're at. I want to hear about the facility that's in, say, San Francisco, or maybe downtown LA or something like that. I think it's going to be really exciting. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Next year we'll do one live from one of these facilities.
Oh, I used to do a lot of these on location. It was so much fun. I can't wait to get back into the real world.
Yeah.
All right. Talk to you later, Leslie. So that was Leslie Lanne, our Northeast urban logistics last mile expert. And thank you so much for joining us today. And for all of you guys out there, do us a favor. If you like this podcast, tell a friend to check it out. Let them know they can find Where We Buy on whatever podcast app they use. We're also on Spotify, or they can stream us on the web at wherewebuy.show. And if you're interested in retail real estate, we also do a YouTube show. If you're watching me on YouTube right now, you're already there. Just click the subscribe button and you're good to go. We go live every Thursday, noon Eastern, with a new update on trends about retail and retail real estate. And if you're listening, you can check us out at everythingweknow.show, and that'll take you right there. When you get there, make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube. We're going to be doing more of these industrial retail convergence shows in the future. It's a hot topic, and we're really interested in covering it well. I'd like to thank all of you guys for joining me today. And as I always like to say at the end of these podcasts, our theme music is Run in the Night by the Good Lords under Creative Commons license.